Detective Sarah Coleman was supposed to be home by 6 that evening. Her daughter had a school play, and she had promised to be there. But then the call came in about the barn, and everything changed. The old barn sat on the edge of what used to be Fisher property, scheduled for demolition the next morning to make way for a new housing development. The construction crew had been doing a final walkthrough when one of the workers noticed something strange about the floorboards near the back wall. They weren't nailed down like the others. When he pried them up to see what was underneath, he found a space that shouldn't have been there, a hidden compartment carved out of the earth beneath the barn, lined with wooden planks and sealed with a heavy wooden cover. Inside that hidden space were 3 items that would reopen one of Pennsylvania's oldest cold cases: a handmade journal, water-stained and moldy but still readable, a cracked Polaroid photograph that showed a young Amish boy standing next to a man's shadow, and a silver wristwatch with an inscription that made Detective Coleman's blood run cold. The inscription read, "To Eli, love Mom, 2003. The problem was that Eli Fisher had vanished in 1993. He was 8 years old when he disappeared from his family's farm, and despite months of searching, no trace of him had ever been found. The case had gone cold decades ago, filed away with hundreds of other unsolved missing person reports. But this watch was dated 10 years after Eli's disappearance, which meant that either Eli had lived for at least 10 years after vanishing, or someone else had been using his name. Detective Coleman stared at the photograph under the harsh fluorescent lights of the evidence room. The boy in the picture looked like he could be in his teens, maybe 15 or 16 years old. His hair was longer than Amish boys usually wore it, and he was wearing English clothes instead of the plain dark clothing of his community. But the face was unmistakably the same as the 8-year-old boy whose missing person poster had hung in the sheriff's office for 3 decades. Eli Fisher had somehow survived his disappearance, at least long enough to have this photograph taken years later. The journal was even more disturbing. Page after page of careful handwriting in pencil documenting what appeared to be years of captivity. The entries were dated from 2002 to 2003, nearly 10 years after Eli's disappearance. The handwriting was that of a teenager, not a child, suggesting that Eli had been alive and writing for a long time after he vanished. Detective Coleman read the first entry with a growing horror. "My name is Eli Fisher, and I was taken from my family when I was 8 years old. I have been kept in the underground place for 9 years now. Uncle John says the world above ended and everyone is dead, but I do not believe him anymore. I remember my mother's voice, and I know she would not just die and leave me." Uncle John. Detective Coleman made a note to research Eli's extended family. She had worked missing person cases for 15 years, but she had never seen anything quite like this. A child taken and kept hidden for nearly a decade, convinced that his family was dead and the world had ended. The journal entries painted a picture of psychological manipulation and isolation that was almost unimaginable. Eli wrote about being told that the surface world had been destroyed in a war, that he was one of the few survivors being kept safe underground. He described a small group of adults who lived in what sounded like a bunker or basement, listening to shortwave radios and preparing for some kind of apocalypse. But as the entries progressed, it became clear that Eli was starting to question what he had been told. He wrote about memories of his family that seemed too real to be fantasies. He described plans to escape and find out the truth for himself. The final entry was dated March 15th, 2003. It was shorter than the others, written in handwriting that looked hurried and scared. "I am going to try to leave tonight. There is a storm coming, and Uncle John will be busy with the radios. I do not know if I will make it, but I cannot stay here anymore. If someone finds this book, please tell my mother, Sarah Fisher, that I tried to come home. Tell her I never forgot her face." Detective Coleman closed the journal and sat back in her chair. Somewhere in those pages was the key to solving a 30-year-old mystery, but it also raised new questions that might be even harder to answer. What had happened to Eli after he wrote that final entry? Had he escaped successfully only to disappear again? Had he been caught and punished for trying to leave? And who was Uncle John, the man who had apparently held a child captive for nearly a decade? She picked up the phone to call her supervisor. Her daughter's school play would have to wait. This case was about to become the biggest investigation Lancaster County had seen in years. Detective Coleman had grown up in Lancaster County, in a family that farmed land adjacent to several Amish communities. She understood the culture of plain living and strong family bonds that defined the Amish way of life. She also understood how protective the community could be of their own, and how reluctant they were to involve outside law enforcement in their affairs. The Eli Fisher case had been handled badly from the beginning, she realized as she read through the old files. When 8-year-old Eli disappeared in 1993, the Amish community had initially refused to involve the police. They wanted to handle the search themselves, using their own methods and their own people. By the time law enforcement was finally called in, valuable time had been lost. The crime scene, if there had been one, was contaminated. Witnesses had been influenced by community pressure to keep quiet about anything that might bring shame on their neighbors. The investigating officer in 1993 had been Detective Roy Hampton, now retired but still living in the area. Coleman called him at home, hoping he might remember details that hadn't made it into the official reports. Hampton was eager to help. The Eli Fisher case had haunted him throughout his career, one of the few missing person investigations that he had never been able to solve. "That boy just vanished," Hampton told her over the phone. "One day he was there, helping his father with the harvest, and the next morning he was gone. No sign of struggle, no ransom note, no witnesses. It was like he'd just walked off the face of the earth." Hampton remembered the family as being deeply religious, but also troubled. Eli's father, Jacob, had been strict to the point of harshness, constantly worried that his son was showing too much interest in the English world outside their community. The boy was curious about everything, Hampton recalled. Cars, planes, electricity, all the things Amish kids are supposed to ignore. His father saw it as a sign of spiritual weakness, but the mother was more understanding. Hampton also remembered something that hadn't made it into the official reports. Jacob Fisher had a brother named John who had left the Amish community years earlier. John had been shunned by the family for abandoning their faith, but there were rumors that he still lived somewhere in the area. "We tried to track down the brother back in '93, but nobody would talk about him," Hampton said. "It's like he didn't exist as far as the community was concerned, but I always wondered if there might be a connection." Detective Coleman felt a chill as she made the connection. Uncle John from the journal entries. John Fisher, the brother who had been cast out of the community and forgotten by his family. She spent the rest of the evening researching property records and tax documents, looking for any trace of John Fisher's activities after he left the Amish community. What she found was disturbing, but illuminating. John Fisher had purchased 20 acres of remote farmland in 1991, 2 years before Eli's disappearance. The land included an old barn and farmhouse, isolated from neighbors and accessible only by a narrow dirt road. According to county records, John had applied for permits to build an underground shelter on the property, claiming he needed storage space for farm equipment. The property had been sold in 2004. A year after the final entry in Eli's journal, the new owners had eventually abandoned it, and it had sat empty for nearly 20 years before being bought by the development company that planned to tear everything down. Detective Coleman realized that the barn where the journal had been found was almost certainly on John Fisher's old property, which meant that Eli had been held captive less than 10 miles from his family's farm, hidden underground while his parents and community searched desperately for any trace of him. She called the construction foreman who had found the hidden compartment and arranged to meet him at the barn first thing in the morning. If Eli had been kept on this property for years, there might be other evidence still hidden there. As she drove home that night, Detective Coleman thought about Eli Fisher, the 8-year-old boy who had been stolen from his family and convinced that the world had ended. She thought about the courage it must have taken for him to question what he had been told, to plan an escape, to hope that somewhere above ground his mother was still alive and waiting for him. But she also thought about the final journal entry written by a scared teenager who was about to risk everything for a chance at freedom. What had happened to Eli after he wrote those words? Had he made it out of the underground prison, or had his escape attempt failed? The answers were somewhere on that abandoned property, buried in the ruins of John Fisher's delusions. Detective Coleman was determined to find them, no matter how long it took. The next morning brought a team of forensic specialists and ground-penetrating radar equipment to the old barn. What they found would reveal the full scope of John Fisher's crimes and finally provide answers to questions that had haunted a family and community for 30 years. But those answers would also raise new questions about justice, forgiveness, and the price of keeping secrets in a community that valued privacy above almost everything else. Detective Coleman stood in the morning mist outside the barn, watching technicians set up their equipment and thinking about the phone call she would have to make later that day. Somewhere in Lancaster County, Sarah Fisher was going about her morning routine, unaware that her son's story was about to reach its final chapter. After 30 years of not knowing, Sarah was about to learn the truth about what happened to Eli. But Coleman wasn't sure if the truth would bring peace or just open old wounds that had never properly healed. The property that had once belonged to John Fisher looked like the end of the world. 30 years of neglect had turned what might once have been a functioning farm into a wasteland of collapsed fences, overgrown fields, and buildings that seemed to be sinking back into the earth. Detective Coleman arrived at sunrise with a team of forensic specialists, each of them carrying equipment that would have seemed like magic to the Amish community that lived just a few miles away: ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, excavation tools, and cameras that could document every inch of what they found. The barn where the journal had been discovered was the largest structure on the property, a traditional Pennsylvania Dutch design that would have fit perfectly into the landscape of any Amish farm. But as the team began their systematic search, it became clear that this barn had been modified in ways that no Amish farmer would ever have attempted. The hidden compartment under the floorboards was just the beginning. Using ground-penetrating radar, the team discovered a network of underground rooms and tunnels that extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. The entire property had been honeycombed with hiding places, storage areas, and what appeared to be living quarters designed for long-term occupation. The entrance to the main underground complex was hidden beneath a false wall in the barn's foundation. When they broke through the concealment, they found a stairway leading down into darkness. The air that rushed out smelled of old wood, mildew, and something else that Coleman couldn't identify. The underground rooms were small but carefully constructed, Someone had spent years building this hidden world, installing ventilation systems, electrical wiring powered by generators, and enough storage space for months of supplies. It was the kind of elaborate preparation that suggested either careful planning or complete paranoia. In what appeared to be the main living area, they found evidence of long-term habitation. Beds with children's sizes mixed in with adult furniture. Bookshelves lined with survivalist manuals, religious texts, and technical guides for living off the grid. A shortwave radio setup that could have monitored communications from around the world. But it was in the smallest room, clearly designed for a child, that they found the most heartbreaking evidence of Eli's captivity. The walls were covered with pencil drawings, the kind of artwork that a lonely child might create to pass the time. Simple pictures of houses, animals, people, and vehicles drawn by someone who had limited art supplies but unlimited imagination. One drawing in particular caught Detective Coleman's attention. It showed a woman in plain dress standing next to a house, with the word "Mama" written carefully underneath. Even after years of being told that his family was dead, Eli had continued to draw pictures of his mother. Forensic specialist Dr. Jennifer Hayes was examining the children's area with special attention to any biological evidence that might still be present after so many years. Hair samples, fingerprints, DNA traces that could definitively prove Eli had been held in this location. This room was occupied for a long time, Dr. Hayes told Coleman. Based on the wear patterns and the amount of artwork, I'd estimate someone lived here for several years, possibly up to a decade. They found other evidence of Eli's presence throughout the underground complex. Clothes in children's and teenagers' sizes hidden in a storage room. Books that had been read and reread, with notes in the margins written in the same handwriting as the journal. Most significantly, they found a hiding place behind a loose board where Eli had apparently kept his most precious possessions. The hiding place contained several items that painted a picture of a child trying to maintain his identity and memories despite years of isolation. A small wooden toy horse, carved in the simple style favored by Amish craftsmen, a pressed flower that might have been picked during his last day of freedom, and a folded piece of paper with a child's attempt to draw a map of his family's farm from memory. But they also found evidence that suggested Eli hadn't been the only child held on the property. In another underground room, they discovered belongings that appeared to have belonged to at least 2 other children. Different sizes, different styles, suggesting that John Fisher's crimes might have extended far beyond the kidnapping of his nephew. Detective Coleman felt sick as she realized the implications. If John Fisher had taken other children, there might be other families who had spent years wondering what happened to their missing sons or daughters. The investigation would have to expand to include missing person cases from across the region. As the forensic team continued their work underground, Coleman drove to the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office to brief her supervisor on what they had found. Sheriff Robert Martinez listened to her report with growing concern, understanding that they were dealing with something much larger than a single missing person case. "We need to contact the FBI," Martinez said. "If this guy was taking multiple children and holding them for years, this is a federal case. We're going to need resources we don't have." But first, they needed to learn more about John Fisher himself. Coleman spent the afternoon researching his background, trying to understand how an Amish man had transformed into someone capable of kidnapping children and convincing them that the world had ended. John Fisher had been born into the same strict religious community as his brother Jacob, but he had always been a troubled child, according to church records that Coleman was able to access through contacts in the Amish community. John had been disciplined repeatedly for questioning religious authority and showing interest in forbidden technologies. As a teenager, John had become increasingly rebellious, staying out past curfew, consorting with English friends, and openly challenging the restrictions of Amish life. When he turned 18, he had been given the traditional choice: accept baptism and commit to the community for life, or leave and be shunned by his family and friends. John had chosen to leave, but unlike most young people who departed the Amish community, he hadn't integrated into mainstream society. Instead, he had become involved with survivalist groups that preached about the coming collapse of civilization and the need to prepare for the end times. By the late 1980s, John was living completely off the grid, moving from one survivalist compound to another and becoming increasingly paranoid about government surveillance and social control. He apparently believed that the Amish community he had left behind was weak and unprepared for the trials that were coming. The purchase of the isolated farm property in 1991 fit perfectly with this worldview. John was creating his own survival compound, a place where he could wait out the apocalypse and emerge as one of the few survivors of civilization's collapse. But somewhere along the way, his preparations had taken a darker turn. Instead of just preparing for his own survival, John had apparently decided that he needed to save others from the coming destruction. And his first target had been his 8-year-old nephew, a child he may have seen as corrupted by the outside world and in need of rescue. Detective Coleman tried to imagine the planning that would have gone into Eli's kidnapping. John would have had to watch the family's routines, learn when the boy might be alone, and figure out how to take him without being seen. The fact that no one had witnessed the abduction suggested careful observation and preparation. She also tried to imagine what Eli's first days in captivity must have been like. A terrified 8-year-old, suddenly separated from everything familiar, told that his family was dead and that he was one of the few survivors of a global catastrophe. The psychological manipulation would have been as devastating as any physical abuse. As evening approached, Coleman returned to the Fisher property to check on the progress of the excavation. The forensic team had expanded their search to include the area around the barn, using ground-penetrating radar to look for any burial sites that might contain human remains. What they found was both heartbreaking and illuminating. About 50 yards behind the barn, the radar detected what appeared to be a shallow grave. The size and depth suggested it contained human remains, possibly those of a child or teenager. Coleman felt her heart sink as she realized what they had probably found. Eli Fisher, the brave teenager who had written about his plans to escape and find his way home to his mother. The boy who had spent nearly a decade in captivity, dreaming of freedom and family. The excavation would have to wait until morning, when they could bring in additional equipment and conduct the work with the care and respect that human remains deserved. But Coleman was already dreading the phone call she would have to make to Sarah Fisher. After 30 years of not knowing, Sarah was about to learn that her son was dead, that he had died not as a child lost in the woods, but as a teenager who had never stopped trying to come home. As she drove away from the property that night, Coleman thought about the investigation that lay ahead. They would need to identify any other children who might have been taken by John Fisher. They would need to determine exactly how and when Eli had died, and they would need to figure out what had happened to John Fisher himself. But first, they would need to give Eli Fisher the dignity of a proper burial and his family, the closure they had been denied for 3 decades. It wasn't the ending anyone had hoped for, but at least it was an ending. The truth about Eli's disappearance was finally emerging from the darkness where John Fisher had hidden it, and with that truth would come justice, even if it was 30 years too late. Sarah Fisher was hanging laundry on the line behind her small house when Detective Coleman's car pulled into the driveway. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and the autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and falling leaves. For a moment, Sarah paused in her work, watching the unfamiliar car with the kind of cautious attention that came from a lifetime of avoiding unnecessary contact with the outside world. Sarah was 70 years old now, a widow who lived alone on the small plot of land that was all that remained of the family farm. Her husband, Jacob, had died 5 years earlier, taking with him most of the memories of their son Eli and the terrible summer when he had vanished. Sarah had never remarried, never had other children, spending the last 30 years of her life in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for news that never came. Detective Coleman approached the house slowly, knowing that the conversation she was about to have would change Sarah's life forever. She had been dreading this moment since the excavation team had confirmed what the ground-penetrating radar had detected. The shallow grave behind John Fisher's barn contained the skeletal remains of a teenage boy, along with personal items that left no doubt about his identity. Eli Fisher had been found, but not the way anyone had hoped. Sarah met Coleman at the front door, her weathered face showing the kind of cautious politeness that Amish people reserve for interactions with English law enforcement. She had been through this before, in the terrible weeks after Eli's disappearance, when police officers had come to her door with questions and theories and promises that were never kept. "Mrs. Fisher," Coleman said gently, "my name is Detective Sarah Coleman with the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office. I'm here about your son Eli." Sarah's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "Eli has been gone for 30 years, Detective. I do not think there is anything new to say about him." Coleman had prepared for this moment, but it was still one of the hardest conversations she had ever had. She explained about the discovery at the old barn, about the journal and the photograph, and the evidence that Eli had been held captive for years after his disappearance. Sarah listened without interruption, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as she absorbed information that rewrote everything she thought she knew about her son's fate. When Coleman finished speaking, Sarah was quiet for a long time. "He was alive," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All those years, he was alive, and I never knew." Coleman nodded. "The journal entries suggest that he thought about you constantly. He never forgot his family or his home. Even after years of being told that you were dead, he never stopped believing that you might still be alive." Sarah began to cry then, not the dramatic sobbing of sudden grief, but the quiet tears of someone who had carried a burden for decades and was finally allowed to set it down. She cried for the child who had been taken from her, for the years they had lost, and for the courage her son had shown in the face of unimaginable circumstances. But she also cried with relief. For 30 years, Sarah had lived with the terrible uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to Eli. She had imagined every possible fate, from him being killed by strangers to him choosing to leave his family and never return. The truth was heartbreaking, but it was still the truth. Coleman spent the next hour answering Sarah's questions about the investigation and what they had learned about Eli's captivity. She explained about John Fisher, the brother who had been shunned by the family and forgotten by the community. She described the underground rooms where Eli had been kept and the evidence that suggested he had been told his family was dead. The hardest part was explaining how Eli had died. The forensic evidence suggested that he had been killed sometime in 2003, around the time of his final journal entry. There were signs of blunt force trauma to his skull, indicating that his death had been violent rather than accidental. He tried to escape, Coleman explained. The journal shows that he had been planning it for some time. We think he tried to leave during a storm, just like he wrote about. But John Fisher caught him and killed him rather than let him go. Sarah asked about John Fisher, the brother-in-law she had barely known but who had destroyed her family's life. Coleman had to tell her that John Fisher was dead, that he had died in 2008 in a car accident in another state. There would be no trial, no chance for Sarah to confront the man who had taken her son. But there was one piece of good news, if it could be called that. The investigation had revealed that John Fisher had taken other children besides Eli. At least 2 other families would finally get answers about missing sons who had vanished without explanation in the 1990s. The scope of John Fisher's crimes was still being investigated, but it appeared that he had been operating his own twisted version of a survivalist compound, taking children he believed needed to be saved from the corrupt outside world and raising them underground while convincing them that their families were dead. Sarah asked to see Eli's journal, the record of his thoughts and feelings during the years of his captivity. Coleman had brought copies of the relevant pages, knowing that Sarah would want to understand what her son had experienced. Reading Eli's words was both painful and comforting for Sarah. Painful because they documented years of loneliness and fear that no child should have to endure, but comforting because they showed that Eli had never lost his faith, his love for his family, or his hope that someday he might find his way home. One entry in particular brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. "I remember Mama singing to me when I was small. I try to remember the words, but I cannot always get them right. Sometimes I sing what I can remember and pretend she is singing with me." Sarah remembered those lullabies, the simple German songs that Amish mothers sang to their children. She had sung them to Eli every night until he was old enough to be embarrassed by such childish things. Knowing that he had remembered them during his darkest hours was a gift she hadn't expected to receive. Detective Coleman explained that Eli's remains would be released to the family for burial once the forensic examination was complete. Sarah would finally be able to lay her son to rest, to give him the funeral that should have happened 30 years earlier. But there was a complication. The Amish community had rules about how to handle situations like this, rules that had been developed over centuries of dealing with tragedy and loss. Some members of the community felt that too much attention had already been paid to Eli's disappearance, that the proper response was quiet acceptance of God's will rather than public investigation and media coverage. Sarah would have to decide whether to bury Eli in the traditional Amish way with a simple service and plain wooden coffin, or whether to allow the outside world to participate in honoring a boy whose story had touched people far beyond Lancaster County. She would also have to decide how much of the truth to share with the community that had known and loved Eli. The details of his captivity and death were disturbing, the kind of information that could traumatize people who had spent their lives believing that evil existed only in the outside world. Detective Coleman left Sarah with her thoughts and her grief, promising to keep her informed as the investigation continued. As she drove away from the small house where Eli should have grown up, she thought about the courage it had taken for a 70-year-old Amish woman to listen to the truth about her son's fate. Sarah Fisher had waited 30 years for answers about Eli. Now she had them, and she would have to figure out how to live with the knowledge of what her son had endured. It wasn't the reunion she had dreamed of, but it was closure of a kind. The investigation into John Fisher's crimes continued for several more weeks, as detectives worked to identify other victims and piece together the full scope of his activities. What emerged was a picture of a deeply disturbed man who had used his survivalist beliefs to justify kidnapping and psychologically torturing children. But the investigation also revealed something else. Eli Fisher had been a remarkable young man who had maintained his humanity and his hope despite years of unimaginable trauma. His journal entries showed a person of extraordinary courage and faith, someone who had refused to let his captor break his spirit. In the end, that might be the most important part of Eli's story, not the terrible things that had been done to him, but the way he had responded to them, the way he had held on to his memories and his love for his family, the way he had never stopped believing that goodness existed in the world even when he was surrounded by evil. Detective Coleman had worked dozens of missing person cases over the years, but she had never encountered a victim who had documented his own experience with such clarity and courage. Eli's journal was more than just evidence in a criminal case. It was a testament to the human capacity for hope in the face of despair. As the forensic work concluded and Eli's remains were prepared for burial, Coleman found herself thinking about the 8-year-old boy who had vanished from his family's farm on a summer night in 1993. He had been taken by someone who claimed to be saving him, but who had actually stolen his childhood and ultimately his life. But Eli had saved himself in the only way that mattered. He had remained true to who he was, faithful to his family and his beliefs, determined to find his way home no matter how long it took. His body had been found in a shallow grave behind a barn, but his spirit had never been captured or broken. That was the legacy Eli Fisher would leave behind, and it was one that would honor both his memory and the family who had never stopped loving him. The funeral of Eli Fisher took place on a cold November morning, 30 years and 2 months after he had disappeared from his family's farm. The service was held in the same meeting house where Eli had attended worship as a child, a simple white building that could hold the entire Amish community when everyone gathered together. Sarah Fisher sat in the front row, surrounded by extended family and neighbors who had known Eli as a curious, bright-eyed boy with an unusual interest in the world beyond their community. Many of them had participated in the search for him in 1993, spending days walking through fields and woods, calling his name, and hoping for a miracle that never came. Now they were finally able to say goodbye. The service was conducted in the traditional Amish manner, with simple hymns sung in German and a sermon that emphasized God's mercy and the hope of resurrection. The bishop spoke about Eli's courage during his years of captivity, about how he had maintained his faith even in the darkest circumstances. But the most moving part of the service came when Sarah herself stood to speak about her son. In a voice that was steady, despite her tears, she shared some of the journal entries that had meant the most to her, the words that showed Eli's love for his family and his determination to return home. "My son never forgot who he was," Sarah said. "He never forgot where he came from or who loved him. Even when he was told that we were all dead, he kept us alive in his heart." She also spoke about forgiveness, one of the central principles of Amish faith. Even though John Fisher had committed terrible crimes against Eli and other children, Sarah said she was working to forgive him, not for his sake, but for her own. "Hatred is a burden that weighs down the soul," she said. "I choose to let go of that burden so that I can remember my son with love instead of anger." The burial took place in the family cemetery behind the Fisher property, in a plot that had been waiting for Eli for 30 years. His headstone was simple, in keeping with Amish tradition, showing only his name and the years of his birth and death. But the dates told a story that would be remembered long after the stone weathered away. Eli Fisher had lived for 18 years, most of them in circumstances that should have broken any child's spirit. Yet he had never given up hope, never stopped loving his family, never lost his faith in the possibility of going home. Detective Coleman attended the funeral, standing respectfully at the edge of the gathering as the community said goodbye to one of their own. She had seen many crime victims laid to rest over the years, but there was something particularly moving about Eli's service. This was a community coming together to heal a wound that had been open for 3 decades. After the burial, several members of the community approached Coleman to thank her for her work on the case. They understood that bringing Eli home had required enormous effort and expertise, resources that the Amish community could never have provided on their own. One of those who spoke to Coleman was Ben Krause, now a middle-aged man who worked as a carpenter in the nearby town of Intercourse. Ben had been Eli's secret friend, the English boy who had shared comic books and flashlights with an Amish child hungry for knowledge about the outside world. "I always wondered if it was my fault," Ben told Coleman, "if maybe Eli got in trouble for being friends with me, and that's why he ran away." Coleman was able to reassure Ben that Eli's disappearance had nothing to do with their childhood friendship. The investigation had shown clearly that John Fisher had targeted his nephew for ideological reasons, not because of any specific behavior or relationship. "Eli treasured your friendship," Coleman told him. "His journal mentions you several times. He was grateful for the books you shared and the glimpse you gave him of the world beyond his community." Ben had brought something to leave at Eli's grave, a comic book, still in its plastic wrapper, the kind of gift he might have given to his friend if they had been able to grow up together. It was a small gesture, but it represented the connection between two boys who had been separated by culture, but united by curiosity and friendship. As the crowd dispersed and families returned to their daily routines, Coleman found herself thinking about the investigation that had brought them all to this moment. The discovery of Eli's journal had answered the question of what happened to him, but it had also raised broader questions about child protection and community responsibility. The case had revealed that John Fisher had been able to operate for years without detection, taking children from their families and holding them in underground bunkers while convincing them that the world had ended. How many other children might have been saved if someone had investigated the strange, reclusive man who lived alone on isolated property? But Coleman also understood the cultural factors that had made detection difficult. The Amish community's emphasis on forgiveness and non-involvement with law enforcement had prevented them from taking action against John Fisher, even when his behavior seemed suspicious. Their desire to handle problems internally had inadvertently enabled a predator. The case had sparked discussions within the Amish community about how to balance their traditional values with the need to protect their children from outside threats. Some leaders were advocating for more cooperation with law enforcement, while others worried that too much involvement with the English world would undermine their way of life. These were complex questions without easy answers, but at least they were being discussed. Eli's death had not been in vain if it led to better protection for other children in the community. Detective Coleman also thought about the other families who had been affected by John Fisher's crimes. The investigation had identified 2 other boys who had been taken and held on the property during the 1990s. Both had died in captivity, their remains found in shallow graves near Eli's burial site. Those families were now going through their own process of grief and closure, finally learning what had happened to children who had vanished without explanation decades earlier. The pain of loss was being joined by relief at having answers, the same complex mix of emotions that Sarah Fisher had experienced. The federal investigation into John Fisher's activities was continuing as law enforcement agencies across the region reviewed unsolved missing person cases from the 1990s. There might be other victims, other families, who deserved to know the truth about what had happened to their children. But for now, the focus was on honoring the memory of the boys who had been found and ensuring that their stories were told with the dignity and respect they deserved. In the weeks following Eli's funeral, Sarah Fisher received hundreds of letters from people around the country who had been moved by her son's story. Parents of missing children, survivors of kidnapping and abuse, and ordinary people who had been touched by Eli's courage and faith. Many of the letters came from other Amish communities, offering prayers and support from people who understood the unique challenges of maintaining traditional values in a dangerous world. But others came from complete strangers, people who had never heard of the Amish before, but who recognized the universal themes of love, loss, and hope in Eli's story. Sarah read every letter, finding comfort in the knowledge that her son's life had meaning beyond the tragedy of his death. Eli's journal, which had been published in excerpts by newspapers across the country, was inspiring other survivors of trauma to speak out about their experiences. One letter particularly moved Sarah. It came from a young woman named Maria Santos, who had been kidnapped as a child and held for 2 years before escaping. Maria wrote that reading Eli's journal had helped her understand that her own survival was not just luck, but the result of the same kind of inner strength that Eli had shown. "Your son's words helped me realize that I am not defined by what was done to me," Maria wrote. "Like Eli, I never forgot who I was or where I came from. His story gives me hope that other survivors can find their way home too." Sarah decided to respond to some of the letters, particularly those from other parents of missing children. She found that sharing her experience of waiting, hoping, and finally learning the truth could provide comfort to families who were still searching for their own answers. Detective Coleman stayed in touch with Sarah during this difficult period, understanding that solving the case was only the beginning of a long healing process. She had seen how the discovery of the truth could be both liberating and overwhelming for families who had lived with uncertainty for years. The investigation into John Fisher's crimes eventually expanded to include law enforcement agencies in 4 states, as evidence emerged that he had moved around the country during his years as a survivalist. The final count of his victims would never be known with certainty, but investigators believed he had kidnapped at least 7 children over a period of more than a decade. Most of those children had not survived their captivity. John Fisher's mental illness had apparently worsened over time, making him increasingly violent toward the children he claimed to be saving. Eli had been one of the oldest survivors, managing to live for nearly 10 years in conditions that had killed younger children much sooner. The case also revealed the existence of a loose network of survivalist groups that had operated throughout the 1990s, sharing information and resources while preparing for what they believed would be the collapse of civilization. Some members of these groups had been aware of John Fisher's activities but had chosen not to report them to authorities. Federal prosecutors brought charges against 3 men who had visited John Fisher's compound and known about the presence of kidnapped children. 2 were convicted of conspiracy and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The 3rd died before he could be brought to trial. But for Sarah Fisher, the legal proceedings were less important than the personal work of rebuilding her life with the knowledge of what had happened to Eli. She decided to move from the small house where she had lived alone since Jacob's death, finding a new home closer to her extended family and the support of the community. She also decided to preserve Eli's memory in a way that honored both his life and his faith. Working with Detective Coleman and other supporters, Sarah established a foundation dedicated to helping families of missing children, particularly those from religious communities that might be reluctant to work with law enforcement. The Eli Fisher Foundation provided resources for search efforts, counseling for families, and education about the warning signs of child predators. It also worked to bridge the gap between traditional religious communities and modern law enforcement, helping both sides understand how to work together more effectively. Detective Coleman became a board member of the foundation, using her experience with the case to help other investigators understand the unique challenges of working with isolated religious communities. She also spoke at conferences about the importance of taking missing person reports seriously, regardless of assumptions about why someone might have disappeared. The old barn where Eli's journal had been discovered was eventually torn down as planned, but not before a memorial service was held at the site. Members of the Amish community joined with law enforcement officers, federal investigators, and families of other victims to remember all the children who had suffered in that place. Sarah spoke at the memorial, reading one final entry from Eli's journal that had been discovered during the later stages of the investigation. It was a prayer he had written during his final weeks of captivity, asking God to help him find the courage to try to escape and to watch over his family until they could be reunited. Lord, help me to be brave like David facing Goliath, Eli had written. Help me to remember that you are with me even in the darkest places, and help my mama to know that I love her, even if I cannot tell her myself. As Sarah read those words aloud, there was not a dry eye among the gathered crowd. Eli's faith had sustained him through years of unimaginable hardship, and his love for his family had never wavered despite the lies he was told about their deaths. The memorial concluded with the planting of a tree on the site where the barn had stood, a living symbol of growth and renewal emerging from a place that had once held so much darkness. The tree was an oak, chosen because of its strength and longevity, qualities that Eli himself had displayed during his ordeal. 5 years have passed since Eli Fisher's story came to light, and Sarah continues to live quietly in Lancaster County, supported by her family and community, but also reaching out to help others who face similar tragedies. She has become an unexpected advocate for missing children, speaking to groups and working with law enforcement when her perspective might be helpful. The foundation that bears Eli's name has helped locate several missing children and has provided support to dozens of families during their darkest hours. It has also facilitated better communication between religious communities and law enforcement agencies, leading to faster responses when children disappear. Detective Coleman retired from active duty, but continues to work as a consultant on cold cases involving missing persons. She keeps a photo of Eli Fisher on her desk, not as he appeared in the missing person poster from 1993, but as he looked in the photograph found in the barn, older and sadder, but still recognizably the boy who had never lost hope. The case changed Coleman's perspective on her work and on the importance of never giving up on unsolved cases. She had learned that evidence can emerge years or even decades after a crime, and that families deserve answers no matter how much time has passed. Ben Krause, Eli's childhood friend, eventually moved back to Lancaster County and became involved with the foundation as well. He established a literacy program that provides books and educational materials to children in isolated religious communities, ensuring that curious young minds like Eli's have access to the knowledge they crave. The program is careful to respect the values and traditions of each community while still expanding opportunities for learning. It's the kind of initiative that might have made a difference in Eli's life, giving him positive outlets for his curiosity instead of leaving him vulnerable to someone who would exploit his desire to understand the world. John Fisher's compound was thoroughly excavated and then demolished, but the site has become an informal memorial where people leave flowers and mementos in memory of the children who died there. The state of Pennsylvania has designated it as a protected site, ensuring that the stories of those children will not be forgotten. Researchers and criminologists continue to study the case, trying to understand how John Fisher was able to operate for so long without detection and what could be done to prevent similar crimes in the future. The case has become a textbook example of how mental illness, isolation, and extremist beliefs can combine to create dangerous individuals who prey on the most vulnerable members of society. But perhaps the most important legacy of Eli Fisher's story is the reminder that hope and love can survive even in the most terrible circumstances. Despite years of captivity, psychological manipulation, and abuse, Eli never lost his essential humanity or his connection to the family that loved him. His journal stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of faith to sustain people through their darkest hours. It's a message that resonates far beyond the Amish community where Eli was born, speaking to anyone who has faced seemingly impossible challenges and wondered if they had the strength to continue. Sarah Fisher visits Eli's grave every week, bringing fresh flowers and spending time in quiet reflection. She talks to him about the Foundation's work, about the families they've helped, and about the ways his story continues to make a difference in the world. She also tells him about the community that never forgot him, about the friends who still remember the curious boy who loved to watch airplanes and ask questions about the world beyond his family's farm. She assures him that he is remembered not as a victim, but as a hero who never gave up hope. The simple headstone in the family cemetery gives no hint of the extraordinary story it represents. But for those who knew Eli Fisher, or who have learned about his courage through the foundation that bears his name, it serves as a reminder that even the darkest stories can have elements of light. Eli Fisher was taken from his family when he was 8 years old, held captive for nearly a decade, and killed when he tried to escape. But he was never truly defeated because he never stopped being the person his family had raised him to be, faithful, loving, and full of hope for the future. That is the legacy he left behind, and it is one that will continue to inspire others long after the details of his ordeal have faded from public memory. In the end, love proves stronger than fear, hope proves stronger than despair, and the truth proves stronger than the lies that were meant to keep it buried forever. The story of Eli Fisher reminds us that every missing child has a family that loves them, a community that remembers them, and a story that deserves to be told. It challenges us to never give up on the missing, to keep searching for the truth, and to hold on to hope even when all seems lost. Because sometimes, even after 30 years, the truth finally comes to light, and when it does, it can set everyone free